more than 55% of young people in this country believe that Israel has no right to exist.
Protests and marches are just not enough when it comes to supporting Palestine.
We have to directly intervene and make material differences to the ability of the Zionists to operate.
And many in the mainstream take that as a direct attack on the Jewish people.
The only thing which is going to stop the genocide in Palestine directly is the axis of resistance, i.e. armed struggle against occupation.
There are many who claim to stand by the Palestinian cause and to support the Palestinians, but have trouble understanding what's truly unfolding in Syria.
Well, because they've been lied to. The military resistance in Gaza is absolutely supportive of Assad. Assad is absolutely supportive of the resistance.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ Podcast. I'm your guest host, Hassan Shami, and today we will be speaking with Professor David Miller, who's widely regarded as Britain's leading scholarly critic of Zionism and is the co-founder and co-director of Public Interest Investigations, which conducts research and watchdog investigations on key social, political, and health issues in the UK and Europe. Professor Miller, thank you for joining me today on TMJ News.
Thank you for having me.
How do you respond to those who've been critical of your true motives of openly supporting the acts of resistance, including Iran and Syria are vital elements of the axis?
I mean, what are my true motives? My true motives are to try and understand and help the Palestinians, and I believe that's the best way of doing that. I mean, the question of Syria is, of course, a question which really divides Muslims, and we've seen that in the last 2 weeks, where the unity there has been over Gaza has been fractured by the launch of these three fronts in Syria, in the north, the northeast, and in near the Golan, supported by Israel, Turkey, and of course the Kurdish forces working directly with the CIA. Now, it's perfectly clear that the reason why the Israelis want to push into Syria is to disrupt the supply lines of the resistance. That's why they've been bombing the border crossings between Lebanon and Syria in the last few weeks. No military purpose to attack Hezbollah by bombing those border crossings. The purpose is to disrupt the possibility of Syrian and Lebanese resistance fighters communicating and helping with each other. And of course, these missiles come through Syria. I don't know where people imagine they come from. They don't just magically appear. They come through Syria. They come from Iran, through Syria, through Lebanon, and to Gaza. I mean, that's the reality. And if you want the Palestinian resistance to win and to stop the genocide, then you have to understand that there are certain material conditions of existence of resistance in Gaza, and those conditions are Syria and Hezbollah, and of course the Iraqi resistance and Syria. I mean, if you look back at what happened in Syria from 2011, so some people say, this was an uprising, it was a revolution. Assad is a dictator. He previously worked with the West, and we must get rid of Assad. Well, I mean, that's not the view of the Qassam brigades of Hamas, and indeed it wasn't the view of Yahya Sinwar before he was killed by the Israelis. Their view was that Syria was their ally, and they didn't support, and the Qassam brigades do not support the rebels in Syria. The military resistance in Gaza is absolutely supportive of Assad. Assad is absolutely supportive of the resistance. So I don't have anything to apologize for that. For those questions, it was a regime change operation by the West, and of course, what does any sensible Muslim say in those circumstances? Do you support the resistance?
You're touching up on Syria, which was going to be my next question. Regarding this major insurgency by the foreign-backed extremist group in Syria, is it safe to say that you believe that this wasn't the timing of this insurgency wasn't a coincidence? Why is it happening at this particular time?
Absolutely, it's not a coincidence. I mean, what's happened? I mean, it's quite complicated because we're caught with the axis of resistance. We're talking about different territories, etc. People aren't always aware, or where Yemen is in relation to Iraq, etc. But look, the Zionists tried to take their land war into Lebanon, and they tried to get to the Litani River and to hold a line there. That was their objective, and they failed. They failed to do that. They've been wanting to get to the Litani River since the 1940s, right? They tried to have that in the UN deal that would be Israel proper, but it was denied at that stage, and they've now failed again to get there because they were despite their pager attacks and the assassination of the leadership of Hezbollah, the fighters of Hezbollah kicked back against them, and they couldn't make it. They were beaten militarily, despite all of the massive bunker busted bombs in South Beirut, etc. But we know, of course, that one of the reasons we know that this is not an accident is because, as I mentioned, that they were bombing the border crossings between Lebanon and Syria for weeks and weeks, and nothing to do with trying to get to the Litani. It's different. It's the other end of the country. Nothing to do with the bombing of Beirut. Again, nowhere near. I mean, they were bombing these because they were preparing for if they couldn't get to the Litani, their next roll of the dice was they had to withdraw. They've come to a ceasefire with Hezbollah, which is a military defeat for them, and so their next strategy is to try and peel off Assad. And if Assad comes away from the axis of resistance, they will lift all the sanctions, etc., etc. Syria will be normalized, and the armed rebellion will just magically disappear. But of course, that's their aim. But Assad isn't going to do that. I mean, he's already made that perfectly plain that Syria supports Palestinian resistance, and so that's what's going on there. And it's, of course, it's not. It's transparently, timed and overseen by the Western powers, Israel, and indeed America, in contact with each other, as an attempt to try and destroy Syria as the next part of their attempt to dismember the whole region and to create a greater Israel.
You mentioned earlier that Syria has divided the Muslims. And what we see on social media and with the thousands of articles being written, there's a lot of confusion, misinformation, propaganda. And so you see that there are many who claim to stand by the Palestinian cause and to support the Palestinians, but have trouble understanding what's truly unfolding in Syria. Why do you think that is?
Well, because they've been lied to. I saw that the people in Aleppo put a Palestinian flag over the balustrade earlier. I mean, these are forces who are friends with Israel, who have said that they're friends with Israel, and I think for me, who listens to me? I'm some white guy from Scotland. Why on earth would you listen to me? Yeah, I've done some research, but why would people care about that? I don't say you should listen to me. I say you should listen to what the Palestinian resistance says. I don't mean Palestinians. It's not an identity politics question. It's a question of the Palestinian resistance, the people in the cockpit of the resistance against the Zionist entity, the Qassam brigades, the Al-Quds brigades, even the Al-Aqsa, the Martyrs brigades, for part of Fatah, but nevertheless, absolutely not part in the same as the PA. So I think people, you listen to them, and what do they say about Iran? They say Iran has our back. Without Iran, we would be in a much worse position than we are. Iran has steadfastly supported us through all of this period. That's what they all say. I put out a long tweet on this the other day, 11 separate statements from Hamas, the PIJ, and the PFLP, and Nasrallah from Hezbollah, all saying the same thing. They all say the same thing. Now, who is it in the Muslim community in the West who can stand up and say the Palestinian resistance are wrong about Iran? I would challenge people to do that.
So many academics in the past year have remained silent on the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And you, on the other hand, have put it all on the line, and you continue to be outspoken against Zionism. And because of this, you faced an unfair dismissal from the University of Bristol. Now that you face the consequences with your dismissal, do you regret being so outspoken?
Oh, not at all. No, I think it's the only thing which I could do in the circumstances. I mean, this has been, for me, going on for some considerable time. It was only 3 or 4 months after I'd started working at the University of Bristol at the end of 2018 that I did a lecture which caused the series of events which resulted in me being sacked in October 2021. And then what happened was that I eventually took a case against the university, and in February this year, the courts determined that I'd been wrongfully dismissed. They hadn't properly investigated and they hadn't properly assessed the investigation. But most importantly, they determined that the reason that I was sacked was not because I had made some comments about Zionist student groups, but because specifically I had anti Zionist beliefs, and the court determined that anti Zionist beliefs were the sort of beliefs which were and should be philosophically protected. They should be protected under law because they were, to use the jargon of the particular act, they were worthy of respect in a democratic society. So that case established that nobody in the country could, in the future, be dismissed for having anti-Zionist views. So that allowed me a certain level of confidence in the kind of things that I've been saying, which of course I'd been continuing to say all the way through the genocide from the beginning on the 7th of October through to today. Many people, of course, yes, have stayed silent, but I'm in the position where I've already won a court case, and no one's going to stop me speaking now. So it's been very difficult for the Zionists to kind of cope with that because there isn't anything they can do to me anymore. I was already sacked. They can't do much more than that. And so I've not for a second regretted what I did. It's been difficult, but I haven't for a second regretted what I did. And as I say to the Zionists, whenever they ask, I'm very grateful to them for having me sacked because it means I can spend almost all of my time investigating and challenging Zionism.
A lot of your research centers around settler colonial conflicts. And you have stated that the Zionist movement is one of the five pillars driving Islamophobia in the UK. And that statement alone created a lot of backlash. Can you elaborate on that statement?
Yeah, I mean the lecture that I did back in February 2019 was on Islamophobia, and I was looking at the way in which Islamophobia is, of course, a form of state-driven racism. It's mainly driven by, in the UK and the US, by the counter-terrorism apparatus of the state. But there are other social movements who helped to push forward Islamophobia, and one of the key social movements which I discussed in that lecture back then was the Zionist movement. And I spent in fact, we know exactly. I spent 2 minutes and 44 seconds discussing the Zionist movement in that lecture. And we know this because the secretly recorded tape of the lecture was released to a Zionist newspaper, and they put it online. You can still go and listen to it. And essentially, what I said was the results and the research which I'd been doing at that stage for some 9 or 10 years. And the research had been initially about Islamophobic think tanks, looking at the main Islamophobic think tanks in the UK, kind of elite think tanks to try and push the government to enact more and more Islamophobic policies. And they've been very successful over the years in doing that. And one of the things we did was we looked at who funded these think tanks, and we found a whole list of funders, the largest funders of the think, something like 10 of the largest 11 funders that we found of these think tanks were all these what then seemed to me to be obscure charities or foundations named usually after a particular individual. And we weren't certain what these organizations were, so we looked them up, and we found out what else they gave money to. And in addition to giving money to pushing Islamophobia, they also gave money to illegal settlements in the West Bank, to the occupation forces, and indeed to a whole range of Zionist organizations. So we determined that these were effectively Zionist family foundations set up by high net worth Zionist individuals with their families, and the philanthropy that they did was to support Zionism. And of course, as in their conception, part of what they did therefore was to support Islamophobia. So that was the basis on which I said that the Zionist movement, or parts of the Zionist movement, are part of the push to encourage hatred, the marginalization of Muslims, and indeed to try and push Muslims out of public life altogether. And at that time, people didn't like that. It was very controversial, and I got complaints as a result of it, and there was a long process, which was then, brought into to bear upon me, and which eventually resulted in me being sacked. Since then, of course, I think everyone recognises now the role that Zionism plays in Islamophobia. It wasn't so well recognised then, and of course, we've gone on in the research which we've done to look at the way in which key Islamophobic concepts have emerged from Zionism, which I think people didn't really understand. So, for example, the idea of Islamic extremism, of Islamic terrorism, the idea of Islamism, which of course is the idea that it's bad for Muslims to use their faith to guide their politics. All of these are terminologies, terms and terminologies, which, when you strip them right back and go back to their history, you find that they were, effectively invented or at least popularized by the Zionist movement themselves. In some cases, like in the case of the terms Islamic terrorism and Islamism, actually by Benjamin Netanyahu himself in a very famous conference that was held in Washington, D.C. in 1984. So I've tried to understand how it is that the Zionists are involved in pushing Islamophobia, and that's been very controversial for some and for the Zionists, and they've tried to stop me speaking about it.
Regarding Zionists and Zionist movements, another interesting claim that you made is that even within interfaith work, the Zionists try to subvert the Muslim community in Britain from political opposition to Zionism. Can you expand on that as well?
So both the security state and the Zionists had determined since then to try and find a way to undermine the ability of the Muslim community to engage in anti-war politics and of course, effectively also in anti-Zionist politics. And one of the ways that they've found, there are many ways I can tell you about them too, but one of the ways they found is that they push interfaith efforts. Now, so for example, in the UK, there is an organization called Misa Nashim, which of course, as the people will know, is the Hebrew and the Arabic word for women. And it's an organization which presents itself as being a partnership between Jewish and Muslim women to think about the difficulties that they have in communicating between different communities and try to find a way for them to be friends and to get on with each other. And it's just about making chicken soup and being nice and trying to move on beyond the kind of hostility that there might be between Muslim and Jewish communities. Now, of course, that's the rhetoric they espouse, but of course, these are not partnerships. These are Zionist infiltration efforts. In this particular case, the organization was set up at the behest of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the main Jewish communal organization in the UK. 230 or 40 organizations are members. It's been Zionist since the 1940s, since just before the creation of the State of Israel. And it set this organization up in order to, as one of the people who believes in this push for interfaith, in order to set aside the question of Palestine. So to try and make the question of Palestine not a divisive issue in domestic politics. And of course, that involves, yes, pushing Islamophobia, but also trying to undermine the ways in which Muslim communities operate, so it makes them more difficult for them to criticize the Jewish community, and in particular, specifically Zionism.
You've mentioned how, they try to undermine the support for Palestine, and you've been clear with your support for Palestine. So one other point of contention that separates you apart from other academics, your colleagues and Western academics, is that you believe that Israel does not have the right to exist. And that, and many in the mainstream take that as a direct attack on the Jewish people. How do you defend this claim?
Well, it's not just me. The recent political opinion poll in the UK showed that a majority, more than 55% of young people in this country, believe that Israel has no right to exist. I mean, it's not really a controversial claim anymore, I don't think. I mean, it used to be controversial before the genocide to say that Israel shouldn't exist. And people, of course, say, oh, well, you're calling for the genocide of the Jews. Obviously, it means that people would be killed and all these kinds of things. Well, of course, it doesn't. It's a settler colonial state, and all settler colonial states have one or two options in their future. Option number one is that they kill all or almost all of the natives or expel them, and therefore they can continue to be a settler colonial state with no natives left. And of course, that's what happened in America and Canada Australia and New Zealand, or the settler colony is collapsed and the settlers are either expelled or become part of a new decolonized nation. And we have various experiences of that. The case of Ireland is one, South Africa is another, Algeria is another. And of course, in the case of Algeria, rather more of the settlers left than was the case, for example, in South Africa. So there are different ways that settler colonial decolonization can happen, but it's clear that that has to be the option. Either they kill all the natives, all the Palestinians, and they create Greater Israel, which of course is what the Zionists want, or there has to be some form of decolonization, which would mean the end of the Zionist settler colony. And in particular, the importance of that is not just so that we can be bad to the Jews or compromise their belief in Israel, which they've had for time immemorial. It's because actually Zionism is so fundamentally racist and so fundamentally genocidal that if we leave any vestige of a Jewish state in the Levant, in West Asia, then what will happen is that there will be conflict in the future and there will be an attempted genocide in the future. So the whole state has to be collapsed, and we then, of course, replace that with a state called Palestine, in which Jews and Arabs, Christians and Muslims are able to live side by side. But they can't do that if there's any possibility to underpin a future Zionist genocide.
And what was the percentage you said of the youth that now believe that Israel doesn't have the right to exist?
55 it was. I mean, I'm surprised it's not higher, to be honest. But
And that's in Britain?
In Britain, yeah.
And so you believe that the greater British society has now been more awakened to the realities of Zionism in recent years, or is this just for the youth?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, of course, the youth are more radical, but yeah, I mean, yes, of course. But it's the experience of the genocide that Zionism was genocidal. Not only was it racist, that it was genocidal. They were deliberately trying to kill all the Palestinians or expel them. And millions of people came to that view for the first time. I can't remember the numbers of people who said to me, "Oh, David, I used to think that what you said about Zionism was, probably researched, but I didn't think it was quite correct." But now we all see it. We see the dead babies. We see the children. We see everything that's happened, and people have seen it, whether it's in the mainstream media or indie media, or indeed on social media. People see, and they have moved beyond this idea of the holy grail of saying that a state has the right to exist.
Professor Miller, what role do you believe academics like yourself have in revealing the truth behind this issue?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm much freer now that I'm not in academia than I was when I was in academia. I'm not just in the terms of the kind of atmosphere in which I work, but also in the amount of time I'm able to devote to researching and finding out more stuff about, for example, Zionism, which I couldn't do when I was in an academic job because I had to do teaching and administration and all the things which the neoliberal university requires you to do. I mean, I believe that intellectuals, let me use a more broader term than academics, intellectuals have a key role in potentially leading a movement which reconceives how things are thought of, especially in the kind of what we call it the imperial heartlands, so the US, to some extent the UK still. But most academics are not able or willing to take that kind of role because they are in positions where it's difficult for them to do that, and also because the kind of things I've been saying in the last year or two have been seen as very, very controversial, even by other academics and even by people on the left. The kind of research that I've been doing has been a shock to many on the left and indeed in academia, and that's because they haven't done enough research on this area and haven't actually worked out what the Zionists are really up to. So I say, look, we have to, yes, of course, deal with the question of imperialism, but we also have to directly target the Zionist movement. It's a fundamentally racist movement which has its own power and which needs to be directly challenged and dismantled in order for us to stop the genocide in Gaza.
So in part of taking this lead role as an academic and a scholar in Britain against Zionism, you have also stated that, protests and marches are just not enough when it comes to supporting Palestine. What else do you believe should be done?
Well, look, I mean, I believe in protests. I've been on many protests. I was in the protests against the Iraq War and stretching back before that. So, demonstrations are important for building movements and for the visibility of public opinion around the world. In particular, people in Gaza see that we demonstrate, and they want to be seeing that we are there and we support them and we hear them. But look, the demonstrations in the case of Iraq and in the case today of Gaza and Palestine, they aren't going to stop the genocide, and we should face up to that. They, at the margins, might pressure the UK or the US government to do something, but they're not going to stop the genocide. The Zionists do not care what we do. And it does, I mean, it doesn't matter how big the demonstrations are going to be. The Zionists are not going to stop because we demonstrate. And nor indeed are the US and the UK governments going to change their policies. They are both tied very, very closely to Zionism. And you can see that in the US with Biden and with Trump, and you see that in the UK with the previous Prime Minister Sunak and the current Prime Minister Keir, Zionist without qualification Starmer. So what we have to do is, if we want to actually engage in meaningful solidarity with the people of Palestine, is to start to try and materially affect the ability of the Zionists to continue their genocide. And that means two things, I think. One, yes, of course, we target specifically the help which is given by the US. 70% of the weapons are coming from the US, 30% from Germany. And the help which has been given by the UK, the spy and surveillance flights from the British bases in Cyprus, the targeting help which is being given by the British to the Israelis. These have to be targeted directly, but we also have to target directly the Zionist movement. So the Zionist movement, as I've been saying, exists in the UK, in the US, and many other countries, and its role is to help, yes, to throw sand in the eyes of the movement in those countries, but also to directly support the genocide in Gaza. So in the US, there's an organization called the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces, and they send millions and millions of dollars every year directly to the occupation forces. And there are many other charities in the US and UK. I would say in the UK, there's between 2,000 and 3,000 Zionist charities, which are engaged on a daily basis in supporting Zionism in the UK, sending money to the occupation forces, sending money to the illegal settlements in the West Bank, and indeed sending money to other Zionist institutions throughout what's called Israel today. So I believe that we have to directly target those institutions, and of course that can be done. It doesn't have to be done by breaching the law, but it can be done directly by nonviolent direct action, by legal cases and legal means and lawfare and all those kinds of things. But it can also be done by direct action, such as has been carried out by what I would call the cutting edge of the anti-Zionist movement in this country. It's an organization called Palestine Action. I believe they have a US branch now, as well as branches in other countries. And what they do is they go into Israeli arms firms in the UK. In particular, the biggest arms manufacturer in Israel is called Elbit Systems. And on a weekly basis, and sometimes more than weekly, they break into these arms firms and they disable them. They smash them up. They pour red paint over the machinery. They lock on. They just make the factories inoperable. And that has resulted in 2 of their bases being closed down, their headquarters being closed down, many suppliers refusing to work with them. And that's a direct, that directly hampers the ability of the Israelis to bring the weapons, to make the weapons in the UK, to bring the weapons to Gaza and use them to kill Palestinian children and others. And so I think that's the way we have to move now. We have to directly intervene and make material differences to the ability of the Zionists to operate.
Now, one other statement that you've made is that without the Islamic Republic of Iran, there will be no Palestine. Can you elaborate a little on that statement?
Yeah, look, I mean, the only way to stop the people of Palestine being exterminated or expelled from Palestine is for the Zionists to be defeated. The defeat of the Zionists is not going to be brought about by the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. It's not going to be brought about by President Trump having some kind of Damascene conversion and say, well, actually, maybe the Israelis are a bit bad and they shouldn't do it. None of that's going to happen. It's not going to be the case that mass demonstrations stop the genocide. The only thing which is going to stop the genocide in Palestine directly is the axis of resistance, i.e., armed struggle against occupation. The axis of resistance, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a term which encompasses military formations in a number of different countries working together. Now, those countries, of course, those factions are the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which is made up of something like 20 or 30 different armed factions. The resistance in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course, and Nasrallah in Yemen. All of the Palestinian factions, by which I mean not just Hamas and its military wing, the Zaldin al-Qassam brigades, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front GC, indeed even the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades of Fatah, who are, as many people don't know, currently engaged in armed struggle in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank against the Zionists. Now, all of these organizations are held together and work together and coordinate with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has, as a matter of foreign policy, created the axis of resistance and invested huge sums of money over the last 20 or 30 years, billions and billions of dollars, is the estimate given by the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Ziad Nakhala. And so that is an indication of the cutting edge of the ability to stop the genocide, and that it will only be done by military force. And not only have the Iranians coordinated this axis of resistance directly, but they have supplied weaponry to it, including, of course, weaponry which is being given to Syria, to the government of Bashar al-Assad, including Russian weaponry, has then been transferred to Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and then at the instigation, it's said, of an Iranian general, General Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, at his instigation, he said to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, that these weapons, these Kornet weapons, the missiles, the Russian missiles, should be transferred to Gaza. Our brothers in Gaza should have these weapons. And Nasrallah said, well, I can't do that until we ask President Assad. And so they did ask President Assad, and he said yes. And that's why Hamas and PIJ and the other Palestinian factions have been able to gain rockets which can target Tel Aviv. Without the involvement of Iran, there would be no such resistance. There would have been no Al-Aqsa flood. And so I think people ought to have a more reflective understanding of actually the only way to defeat the Zionists is militarily, and the only people who are giving them support are Iran and the other factions in the axis of resistance. It's not Qatar, it's not the UAE, certainly isn't the Saudis, it's not Bahrain, it's not Egypt, it's the axis of resistance. That's why I say that, without the Islamic Republic of Iran, we would already be in a situation where most or all of the Palestinians would have been killed.
Professor Miller, I'd like to end this conversation with one last question. If your work and your academic legacy can be best known for one long-lasting and key message, what would you like that to be?
That it's not enough to be pro-Palestinian, that one must be anti-Zionist. And that anti-Zionism means not just being critical of Zionism, it means collapsing the Zionist entity and ending Zionism as a functioning ideology in the world. That's what I believe is the main contribution that my life will have, if it has any contribution.
I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today on TMJ News. It's been a pleasure, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on this latest episode today. If you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share this video, and make sure to subscribe to this channel for more content.